Hi everyone, and happy Labor Day weekend. Welcome to How to College for First Gens, where we share the narratives of fellow First Gens and get a real glimpse as to what it's like to be a first generation student. For those of you tuning in for the first time, our goal here is to democratize knowledge that we've gained along the way, learn a bit more about the first gen experience, and hopefully help others going through some of the challenges we've experienced by sharing lessons learned from fellow first gens. I am Luz, one of the podcast co-hosts, and a first generation student myself. This month, we'll be highlighting different aspects of the college process and applications. For today, we dive into the topic of study abroad. Although usually not as rigorous or intense as applying to college, studying abroad requires applications and preparation. Taking part of your academic journey to a whole new country can be a daunting but also very exciting experience. Our guest today features current study abroad advisor who breaks down some of the common questions to help students take that first step towards figuring out how to even go about studying abroad. She shares about her own experience studying abroad in France. Our second guest shares her experience partaking in multiple short abroad programs and completing a graduate degree completely abroad. Join us today as we explore our guest stories of how they went about going abroad and why, how it's impacted their trajectories, and the tips that they offer fellow first gens who want to know more. Our first guest today is Yahaira, who spent time abroad in France and is now a study abroad advisor at Rice University. So Yahaira, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, I'd love to. So my name is Yahaira. I grew up in Houston. My parents are from Mexico and I'm first gen. I attended Rice University with Luz and I studied psychology and French studies. And while I was at Rice, I studied abroad for a semester and then I taught English abroad after I graduated, both in France. Yeah, in terms of my experience in college, I really enjoyed it and I was pretty involved. And I think overall it was a pretty positive experience, and I still keep in touch with a lot of the people that I met at Rice.
Well, one thing that I always heard when Rice would visit my high school was about their study abroad. And I think that's where I first learned about the whole term. It was this buzzword that other kids would ask about. They'd be like, oh, so what kind of study abroad opportunities does your college offer? And so Rice always had this really great answer and stuff. So what about you? When did you first find about what the study abroad concept is? And when did you first think about it as a potential avenue for you?
Yeah, so I studied French starting in middle school. So kind of the idea of going to France kind of started at that time. But the idea of study abroad, again, the props go to my sister because she studied abroad when she was in college. And we're very different. So she studied German, I studied French. And she went to Vienna for a semester. So that's kind of where I had the best understanding of what study abroad was. And I think in high school, our teacher talked about it, but I didn't really understand the concept until my sister went. And I was obviously well, I'm not going to Vienna, but I know I'm going to study abroad. So before I got to college, I was already telling my parents, you let her go abroad. So I should be able to go abroad. And so I already went into it knowing I wanted to study abroad, and I continued taking French classes. And like I mentioned, I studied psychology and French studies, but going into college, I didn't even think about graduating with a degree in French studies. I took so many classes that I ended up getting it. And so more so once I was in college, in our classes, our professors would talk about study abroad, and then the French department did a really great job of kind of promoting study abroad and talking about programs. And that's how I found out about the program I ended up doing. And they also had a lot of opportunities for scholarships and aid. So that was kind of the biggest parts. And then I went to the study abroad office and kind of figured out what the process was like. And it was actually, something that was achievable and manageable. So that's kind of my process.
Yeah. So since you were planning on going to France and obviously you were taking French classes, was there a specific timeline that you wanted to make sure you went and did study abroad at that time, when you felt like you knew enough French to get by? Or how did that going to a country where it's not your native language, how did that affect your decision?
Yeah, I was very scared about the language part of it because I did take some of my or all of my courses were in French, and half of them were at an actual French university. So that was really daunting. So I was, officially at this 300 level, which is high enough to be able to take the courses abroad, but you still doubt yourself, I think, and you question whether you are actually capable of taking courses, because then that affects your GPA, it affects your academic trajectory. But I was encouraged by my advisor, and they said, no, if you meet this requirement, you are okay. But yeah, it did take some adapting. And also, once you're there, you're exposed to the language, you kind of improved your language without even really realizing it. So if I had stayed at the level where I was when I went into the program, it would have been really difficult. But I got better as I was there. So that's, I think, really what helped me. But it was scary. And I do get those questions from students. And I can only speak from my experience, and I can't say exactly whether you will feel 100% confident once you're there. Some students feel confident before they go anyway, and other students feel less confident. But they have those requirements for a reason in place. And some programs, even in France, you don't have to speak the language. It just, for me, it made sense because I'd been taking it so long for me to use it. So it's not like just because you don't speak a language, you can't go to a country or study abroad. But that was just my personal experience.
Gotcha. So I guess it really depends on the specific program that you're doing and what those requirements may be. So different programs, I imagine, have a whole wide set of requirements. So what was it like when you were choosing that program, and how did your program differ from what your regular college experience would have been at Rice during the time that you studied abroad?
Yeah, it was very different. So, I mean, aside from the language, just the structure of the courses was very different. And I was lucky enough, I was taking French courses at Rice. So part of that was them talking to us a bit about the schooling system in France. So if you're going to a place where maybe they just speak English, or you maybe aren't told the schooling system beforehand, I would research it just to get an idea. And I think the US is always does its own thing, like the metric system, and they're always doing their own thing. So even in terms of how they teach, it's very different than most places abroad, where in the US you have pretty constant check-ins, assignments constantly, and you always have a lot of grades. Abroad, for the most part, it's a lot less grades, less assignments, but more responsibility on you to kind of keep up with the material, which for me was anxiety inducing. So that was something I had to kind of learn to adapt to. Yeah, basically the way that they teach classes, you have your lecture portion and then you have a smaller group portion, at least in France. So that was very different than what I was used to in my courses back home. And also just Rice, I think, is also just very different even within the US. So I can't speak to other schools in the US, but where I went to school in France, the community wasn't necessarily as tight-knit. So that took a little bit more adapting to. Whereas when I was studying abroad, I really was able to focus on, these are my courses, these are my classes, that's what I do at school. Maybe you join a club or something, but then you spend time really getting to know where you are. I had a host family, so getting to know them and really focusing on the things I really, really wanted to do. And I think that's a metaphor for life in the US versus life abroad as well. But yeah, so it took some adapting for sure in terms of the structure. It was very different than Rice, but I learned things about myself through that process, and I did prefer the structure at Rice in the end, but I learned a lot. And yeah, as I mentioned, at Rice, they taught us a bit about the schooling system. Something else that you usually we'll see abroad is the grading is harsher, which can be kind of it messes with your brain a little bit. But for example, in France, the grading system is out of 20, and they, at least at Rice, they would tell us, 20 is for God, 19 is for the professor, 18 is maybe the highest grade a student will get in the class. So you had to set your expectations, and actually a 10 out of 20 was still passing. So they were harsher graders. They were harsher graders. But then, for example, if you're studying abroad, when you get your transcript, they will translate it into the equivalent of like an American grade. So even though like a 10 out of 20, you think like that's a 50, I think it's more like a C or something like that. Or I don't know exactly how you translate it. But yeah, that was a big thing. And that's pretty universal, I think, for a lot of places abroad. And then you have less coursework or less assignments. So that was a big thing, I think.
Huh. That's a very interesting experience. So it sounds like you definitely grew, and maybe that wasn't something you were expecting like right off the bat that would happen, but it did, and it sounds like a positive thing. So that's good. And did you have a chance to really explore the place you were at, and like did you feel culture shock while you were there, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I feel like I did and I didn't. Like I because it can be overwhelming, right? This is a new place, and especially I studied abroad in Paris, which is, a very touristic place, and it's a big city. There's obviously a long list of things that you can do. So I didn't get through that whole list, and I was pretty bummed at the time that I hadn't, but I realize now like it would be impossible. And it means that I actually got to, sit down and go to a cafe or walk around. Like I wasn't constantly like, I need to get all these things done in this day. And I've gotten to go back. So that's one thing that I think is not possible. You can't do everything, and that's okay. And in terms of culture shock, I I did experience culture shock to a certain extent. And I mentioned at the beginning, I studied abroad for a semester, and then I taught English abroad that was like a school year. So I actually feel like I experienced culture shock slightly when I studied abroad, but then I experienced it to a whole nother level when I taught English. And I think it's because I had a stronger support system when I was abroad for a semester. Along with my family, I had my home, like my host university staff, my home university staff, the staff with my program. I had financial aid, scholarships, a host family. So it was harder some days than others, but I kind of always had that little safety net. And one big thing I think when I was abroad for the semester was it did take me some time to adapt coming from somewhere like Texas or South, the South, and having family that's from Mexico. People tend to be a lot warmer. And in Paris, things are a lot more on the go. It's similar to New York City. So it's not just like, I think there's a stereotype that French people are cold or French people, and that's not the case. It's just, it takes a little bit more time to like get them to warm up, especially in a place where they're just busy. Their priority is not to open the door for you and smile at someone they don't know, but you get to know them, and it's, you do develop the relationships, but it takes a little bit longer. It's a little bit different than, here. And so I do like clearly recall my first trip outside of France was to Madrid. And so it was kind of like a breath of fresh air because I felt a little bit more of a kinship, and I got to speak Spanish. And so that was kind of a nice reset for me. But yeah, for sure, when I taught English, I experienced it very heavily. And that's to say, I had actually already been abroad for a semester. I don't know how it would have been for me if I'd never been abroad before that. And so I had the like worst homesickness I've ever experienced in my whole life. I was pretty down. And I think a big part of it was just I didn't have support in the same way. I obviously had my family, but to a certain extent, you don't want to burden them, I guess is the word. You don't want to, let them know how you're feeling. But yeah, I mean, I was abroad for a lot longer, while also it was my first time experiencing life as an adult, quote unquote. But with the added hurdles of being in a new place with a foreign language, a different way of doing things, getting an apartment, paying bills, opening a bank account, learning how things are done in a country like, with bureaucracy and things like that, all while doing a job that I wasn't trained for. Yeah. So
yeah, that is so crazy. Yeah, I can't imagine having all of those different responsibilities and like being in a new place. And yeah, wow.
Going abroad, if you can, while you're a student, you will have more support. if you eventually want to go abroad again, or just even if you want to go on a trip later or whatever, a longer period of time, it is beneficial in that sense for sure.
Yeah, because I feel like studying abroad is just so much more different than if you're just going there on vacation. You're just getting like a whole different perspective because you're living there, you're, taking classes there. So yeah, it's yeah, even if you had like just gone abroad, like it wouldn't have even compared, I'm sure.
Yes. And it becomes like a second home or like third home. I don't know, however many times you go abroad, but because even I studied in Paris, but then I taught in the south of France. So even readjusting to a different French culture, that was different too. So yeah, it is definitely different than just going for vacation or a few days.
Okay, so digging a little bit deeper into just how people even get to a new country, like what does the application process typically look like? And like as a study abroad advisor, what kind of advice do you give to your students? Like how early on should they be even thinking about, starting the process with studying abroad?
Yeah, so in terms of the application process, we get this question a lot. If the application process or getting into a program is like applying to college, and it's not. It's not as intense. It's not as competitive. There's maybe a handful of programs or universities where it can be, more competitive. But overall, it's pretty manageable, especially if you start kind of thinking about it, doing it earlier rather than later. I think the biggest things I always tell students are going to be things that aren't really in your control so much. So like the recommendation, for example, we ask for one, not everyone will, but we do. And that is from like a professor that's taught you at Rice, at least. And then kind of starting to figure out courses. For some students, it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward, or they're just looking for transfer credit. So they don't really need to have a conversation with anyone. And then for other students, depending on your major, it can be a lot more, work and more unknowns. So it will vary from student to student. Outside of that, though, I would say it's manageable. And there are things that you can do ahead of time to make the process even smoother. I think for me, it was manageable, pretty easy. I do recall clearly, like there was one thing that I don't know if I just forgot or I didn't read the instructions properly, but I was almost late in submitting it and I had like a little panic attack or a moment of panic, but it was okay in the end. But yeah, just kind of making sure you're reading instructions, doing things on time. I think the visa process, which comes after, that's not part of the application process. That's actually probably what I disliked the most before going abroad. That was probably one of the most challenging parts. It was more challenging, at least for France, than some of the other parts of the application process. So for that, again, I just tried to plan ahead as much as possible. And that's kind of the one of the biggest things that's your responsibility as a student because you're the one going abroad. So you're the one getting the visa. So it's kind of like a crash course for study abroad because it's like one of the first challenges you encounter, but it's manageable. It's just always doing things earlier rather than later. And then in terms of how early you can start the process, so there's kind of different parts of the process, right? There's getting in touch with the office or in some way, and then there's actually meeting with an advisor. So we always tell students meeting with the advisor or starting that application process, a good rule of thumb, because every university is different, but I think a good rule of thumb might be the beginning of the semester when you're going to apply. So that means depending on the application deadline for your particular program or university. By the time you meet with the advisor, ideally you want to have a little bit of a plan, at least, or goals in mind of what you want to do. And then those resources and those people kind of help you get to that point. Yeah, and again, it varies by university. Like at Rice, you can't go freshman year. So you don't really come in to meet with someone unless maybe if you're thinking the summer, maybe your freshman year, but otherwise you're still figuring out like yourself, right? You're figuring out what you want to study. You're figuring out what those goals might be. You change a lot in every year that you're in college, but those first couple of years, you may think you're wanting to do something and you change. And so give yourself some time to go through those changes and it helps solidify your goals.
Yeah, so it sounds like the key point here really is if you're thinking about doing it, start early and maybe just meet with an advisor to see what your options are. Because I think, yeah, for a lot of students, maybe they haven't considered it. And when they go into the office, maybe they realize, like, oh, like I can't fit it into my schedule. So maybe I can't do it or something like that.
Right. Yeah. The earlier, the better. But yeah, I think at least holding off your first semester just so you get acclimated to your own environment. And again, different universities have different kind of guidelines or eligibility requirements. I think in some universities you can go your freshman year if that's like the best time for you or the only time, then consider it. But if not, I would encourage you to wait a little bit longer so that you have your bearings and then you get to experience this completely new environment after kind of getting a little bit acclimated to your home environment.
So do you have to like go through the study abroad office if you're planning to do anything study abroad, or can you directly apply to some of these programs? So how does that like application process work?
Yeah, so I speak more specifically in terms of like study abroad. So there's also other opportunities to go abroad as well. So faculty-led programming is still under study abroad, but for example, at Rice, the departments run their programs and you apply through them. There's also like volunteering abroad or, fellowships or things like that, which don't actually go through our office. It is advisable to talk to your office and go through them. And usually, at least in our case, we've gone through the program list and really kind of vetted the programs that are there. And there are plenty of other programs that are available, but maybe, they're cutting corners in places where you don't want them to cut corners, or they don't have a connection to your university. So if there's a problem, that communication isn't there, or the transfer credit doesn't come back because there's an issue with the way that they process transcripts or things like that. So ideally go through your university, but in the summer, there's a little bit more flexibility, and students sometimes will find a program that, in the summer we don't have because that list is so much bigger and we can't really hit all of the different types of programming, but they may still go through our office, and it'll just depend on what program they're doing. But yeah, for a semester, I would highly advise that students go through their university because, at least in the case for Rice, you do have to separate from the university. And then in that case, like if you're receiving financial aid, you don't get financial aid because you're not a student. Obviously in the summer, it's a little bit different because you're not getting aid during the summer, but it's same thing. Like if you're going in the summer and you do, for example, receive a Pell Grant during the school year, you are eligible for aid from the school during the summer, but only if you are going through the office, for example. Or if you're applying to an outside scholarship, same thing. They might ask for the school to fill out something, and we may not be able to do that if you're not going through us. So the ideal, obviously, is going through the university. But yeah, if you're doing something that isn't study abroad, it's not for credit, then sometimes you just apply for that separately. But yeah, it's nice to have the support of your school, and then also things like health and safety, and you still have access to the resources on campus even while you're abroad. So it is more beneficial.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think maybe that's something that students maybe forget about or maybe take for granted, and then realize like, yeah, if you don't do it through your school, then that's no longer an open door. So really glad that you brought that up. What are some other challenges that you have seen students face with, getting through the application process and actually getting out and like going to another country to study abroad?
Yeah, I think in terms of like challenges, I'll go back to saying, the earlier you start, the better. Sometimes those applications are started very like last minute. And so even though you can put it together, it's not always, but if you can put it together, it's not going to be your best. You're not putting your best foot forward. And I think the biggest thing for me is it doesn't leave a great impression on the people that you're working with, whether that's, your advisor. And we're, for example, if we have aid through our office, it's not going to leave a great impression if I'm, considering students for like a grant for merit or whatever it may be. And also you're asking for a recommendation. You never want to ask for a recommendation last minute because that's not a good look. And also, professors are busy and you have to give them a certain amount of time. and you may want a recommendation from that person again. So just thinking about those kinds of things that are not, you may be thinking just, oh, I'm applying, like it's just, on me, but there are other players in the process. So just kind of thinking about that. And then just in terms of first gen specifically, I think some challenges are going to be, thinking about finances, thinking about your parents or your guardians and their take on it, and having to, explain to them and help them wrap their minds around the idea. I think that is a challenge that not every student is going to face, but I understand it and it happens. And so you have to try and get as much information and look at as many resources as possible to, in terms of finances, like I mentioned, semester is preferable because if you receive aid, it go with you, or just making sure that you are really looking at what scholarship opportunities there are and being on top of that. And with parents, guardians, especially if you're first gen, you're probably the first in your family or one of the first in your family to go abroad to take classes or do anything, whatever it is. So there will be, sometimes those conversations you're trying to convince your parents. I think in those cases, when a student asks me, I can kind of run through big talking points that are helpful. And, we have some resources as well. So if that's a concern, maybe talking to your advisor or looking on your university's website, or if maybe your university doesn't have a ton of information, there's plenty of other universities that have information on their website as well. And then I think just preparing like mentally for the experience, that's a big challenge. There will always be things that arise and you can't prepare for everything. That's impossible. Like going through all your things on your list of things to see, it's also impossible to prepare for every single scenario. And I think for some people that's hard. Like you want to be ready for everything. You're a planner. It's impossible. There's going to be things that happen, and that's part of the process. And you really have to ride, you're going to have a lot of highs. You're going to have a lot of lows. You really have to embrace both. You have to embrace the best and the most challenging parts of the experience. Don't try and fight it too much. You're navigating a new culture, maybe a new language, a new school system. You might be missing home. There might be things that happen, and this is very cliche, but it's part of the growth, and everyone goes through it in some form. In the moment, it may seem like you're the only one that is going through it, but just preparing as much as you can, I think, is all you can do, and doing research on your location.
But what do you think students can do once they get there to really make the most out of their experiences while they're abroad?
Sometimes what I see with some students is if they have the means, they'll be traveling all the time, which is great. Maybe you're thinking, I won't get to come here for a long time, so I want to explore everywhere. But I think sometimes a big thing that they miss is getting to know that the place that they're actually in, like the city or the country that they're in. And that's a missed opportunity. I did just a couple of trips when I was abroad for my semester abroad. So I really got to know like Paris and France, even because they would organize trips for us where we would see like the Loire Valley, the castles, and different things like that are harder to get to, which was really nice. It's really just making the most of the resources that you have on hand. And I think one thing that's a little bit difficult is there's going to be people at different like financial, I guess, statuses. I don't know what you would call it exactly, but like I said, some students are going to be traveling all the time and maybe you can't. Or, I think that can be hard for some students. I've heard, some students come back and say, well, everyone else was traveling. I couldn't go with them, or like they would invite me and I couldn't go. And I think it is definitely, it can be frustrating, or it can be a bummer not to be able to do that. But taking the positive side of that and saying, well, actually, I'm going to really get to know the place that I'm living in. And that's really what makes it a second home or third home, whatever. You really feel like you've gotten to know the place that you're in. So, making sure that you have a good balance of those things and don't put too much pressure on yourself to do everything that you plan on doing. Because like I said, you're not going to be able to do it. But making the most of those experiences that you have. And some things, I think one other thing is just you want to be in touch with people at home, and you want to, have that connection still, but don't stay too attached. Because if you're, at home just FaceTiming with family and friends all the time and you're not getting out, then you'll regret that side of things after the fact. And don't completely lose touch, because my parents would have killed me. But but again, there's a balance there.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Yahaira, for joining us and telling us a little bit more about your own study abroad experience and what it's like to be a study abroad advisor, and giving us a little bit of those nuances for students to keep in mind as they're planning their study abroad experiences. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our second guest is Clara, who partook in shorter abroad experiences while in undergrad, but then did her master's completely abroad in the UK. Clara, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Hi, Luz. Thank you so much. So my name is Clara Martinez. I went to college at Linfield, where I studied political science and communication arts. I did my master's at the London School of Economics. And right now I'm in a mentorship program designed for young professionals with a platform called Pro Fellow. So I'm the first person in my family to graduate from high school and college and get my master's. I'm Mexican American. I am the proud granddaughter of a former bracero.
Very cool. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit about yourself. So before we dive into the whole study abroad topic, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what your experience was like going to college?
Looking back, I think I was in such a sort of go, go, go mode that I don't think I fully took the time to sort of pause and sort of ask myself, what am I doing? And so I think it was just, in overdrive mode. And that experience, it feels slightly like a blur, to be honest. So I loved my college experience. Linfield is a private liberal arts institution in McMinnville. And I did everything from speech and debate to residence life to student government and Frederick Douglass Fellowship with the Department of Political Science. So all of those things were really enriching. And I think like most first-gen students wanted to sort of get experience and exposure beyond the classroom. I think we're all slightly kind of bookworms and we love learning for the sake of learning, but there's so much more beyond the four walls of a classroom that I think much of that was sort of motivating me to get good grades and to learn skills like public speaking. And I think that experience was great.
So it sounds like you were pretty busy while you were in college. So where did you even find the time to think about studying abroad? Or when did it even become a concept that you were aware of?
So the thing about the field is they, from the very beginning, I think it was in orientation, that orientation week, made a plug for studying abroad. That was a main selling point for them. They covered your first round trip airfare to wherever you wanted to study abroad, whether it was a semester or a month. So I was fortunate enough to go to a school where that was the incentive. And I think a lot of universities and colleges do the exact same thing. They're incentivizing their students to go abroad, because I think colleges and universities, the administrators know how transformative those experiences can be. And so because, a semester abroad may not have necessarily fit into my schedule at the time or into what I, wanted to do, I did come across the Fulbright Summer Institute program. It's very competitive. At the time when I was a participant, it was in its second pilot year. So from the very beginning, the Fulbright staff were like, you guys are going to be our guinea pigs, so just sort of go along for the ride. And we did, and it was amazing. So the Fulbright summer program was in Wales, this is sort of slightly obscure country in the UK. So I managed to actually connect with scholars who were familiar with the Welsh language, with the culture, through my own sort of networking with professors. And so, I learned more about it, really refined my pitch for why I felt that this would be a great summer enrichment opportunity. And I was fortunate enough to work with the competitive and scholarship advisor at the time, Debbie Olson, whom I will never forget. So she had this sort of method where with every student who was interested in applying or who wanted to apply to any kind of Fulbright grant would need to meet with her and review the first draft of their application. And I think my very first draft was okay of why I was sort of pitching myself to the program. But then she got me thinking about, why, asked me all kinds of questions that, had me rewriting the first draft all over again. And so had it not been for her guidance, for her working with me to really create a sort of narrative around why I wanted to do that, I don't know that I would have been as successful in the application process as I was. And so I also think that colleges and universities have these fantastic staff members whose job it is to, help you shine. And so these sorts of programs, I know they can feel sort of out of reach or that we're not competitive enough, for them because of our backgrounds or because of X, Y, and Z. And because I think I had a similar thought. I thought, I'm not competitive for this. Had I just sort of written myself off, I would have missed a really life-changing opportunity that really set in motion the course of my career. So I cannot stress just sort of, even if something, because of its prestige or whatever, seems out of reach, unless you don't put forth your story in an honest way and give it your best shot, there's no way to know. And I think that was the motivation behind it was, I really want to go abroad. I don't have, the resources to do that or the time right now. And so finding a program that would be a good fit. And it just so happened that this particular program was about 3 weeks in length. So I think since the launch of the program, Summer Institute program, it's all in the UK, of course, but there are different, for students who are interested in theater or who are interested in agriculture or politics, right? There's different programs out there. And so just looking into it and seeing if it's something that you'd be interested in doing is something I'd encourage your listeners to look into.
So I want to take a step back here and talk about like the different kind of study abroads, because I think most students, when they hear study abroad, they're like, oh, like being abroad for like a semester or something. But that was not the case for you during your college time. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about some of those differences and like how that varies in terms of the structure of the program, maybe the length and maybe like credit. How does that compare to this more traditional study abroad image?
Yeah, definitely. So the two experiences I'll talk about is the Fulbright summer program in Wales and then a Jan term, which is a month-long term in Italy and Greece. So for the Fulbright program, I think I should stress that as a study abroad program, it's about as fancy and as much as like of a cushion as an undergraduate student could ever get. And I say that just because if you're flown out there, you have these university staff who are sort of ushering you from one place to the other, and you're having dinners with diplomats and ambassadors, and you're going to embassy receptions. And so there's a component of it that's very sort of glittery and shiny and just very kind of elegant, and it's sort of high profile. And so in that regard, I don't know, I hesitate to sort of compare it to a traditional study abroad program, because when you go abroad, you're kind of on your own. When you're studying for a semester somewhere at a university, I had a friend who did that, and as we sort of compared notes, I thought to myself, there's a pretty big cushion between, having a program that sponsors you to go, abroad and pays for everything. And, you're kind of taken care of from beginning to end and sort of a thing. You're still learning, and there's great study abroad component to it, but you're with a cohort. Thing about the Fulbright program, my cohort, there were 8 of us total, and we were from all across the country. And I think the unique thing about the 8 of us going to study in Wales, I don't think any of us would have ever crossed paths had it not been for this summer program. And so the fact that we were all so different and had we were studying very different majors, and yet we all somehow came together based on this mutual interest in wanting to spend a summer in Wales. So I think that was a distinguishing feature as well. And we actually went to 3 different universities. So we studied at Cardiff, Bangor, and Aberystwyth. We studied politics. We took a class on, the Welsh language. And that is where I learned that there are just certain sounds that I cannot make in a given context, just practicing the language. And so that was really fun. to do that. We went, sea level traversing, diving, off a cliff into the Irish Sea, part of this sort of all encompassing immersion in the culture, the landscape, and just getting a feel for the country in the most holistic way possible. And so I think that was slightly different. And there was an academic piece to it as well. We wrote journal entries. And so while we could spend time in pubs, I also distinctly remember in the evenings sort of leaving a note in my little dorm room saying, "Guys, I'm at the library, don't wait up." At the end of the program, all of us received college credit for those journal entries and got a grade and everything. I don't remember that the credits transferred directly in terms of it affecting sort of one's GPA, but I think it was more having it show up on a transcript that, I had studied at these, or at this university, and the credits would show up. And so I mean, there was a bit of a negotiation. I remember having to really push for wanting that those credits to transfer, because I felt it was an important part of the experience. And I think had I not insisted with the university staff, both at my home institution and at the universities in Wales, I don't know that would have happened. So it's all about, advocating for the things that are important to you, and doing so in a way that it makes sense why you're asking for this particular credit to appear on your transcript. And so, that's that experience. And the other sort of non-traditional route, and I don't know how common this is across different universities, but there is a sort of month-long break where you take sort of the month off. It's called January term. And some students take a class on campus, some go home. I chose to apply for a study abroad program, focus on theater and oratory. So studying, ancient Greek and Roman orators, and spending 2 weeks in Italy and 2 weeks in Greece just sounded like the most wonderful way to spend that month. And the thing about this particular program as well is that it was led by faculty members. And so you're essentially going with professors and your peers, right? So students as well. And so in that aspect too, I think there was a bit of a cushion with, I was going to take this class with a professor I knew, someone who was actually my faculty advisor, with friends I had already been in class with. And so there was a sort of familiarity to it where we were sort of as a group going to explore Europe. That said, I think I sort of also want to stress the competitiveness of these programs. Even for the Jan term program, I remember having to draft up a thorough, short answer essay of some kind to explain why I wanted to go, because it's competitive. They only have 20 spots or so for students to go. And, everyone, you're competing with theater majors and communications majors and intercultural, majors who all would like the chance to go on this really awesome trip. And so they had that and an interview process. And so I remember interviewing and having to pitch, why I wanted to go to Italy and Greece, and beyond the just who doesn't want to go to Italy and who doesn't want to go to Greece, especially in the summertime or in off season, So I think that experience was great. And in the end, I do remember thinking, what am I going to do if I end up not being able to go to the program? But I think, it worked out really well. And the program itself was really fun. This, in terms of sort of the material we covered, there was, we were essentially reading the Theban plays. We were studying Greek and Roman orators like Cicero, Demosthenes, and Quintilian. To go back to your question about, the traditional versus non-traditional study abroad opportunities, I think if it's something, that students have that itch to study abroad, they don't necessarily have to commit to a semester-long program to do that. There are shorter term programs out there that are just as enriching, just as transformative. And it's just a matter of getting a bit creative and figuring out where you want to go and why you'd like to go there, or what you would like to learn. And so, I think that there are definitely ways to make it happen.
Yeah, definitely. And you alluded to this earlier, but some of these programs, like you mentioned, are pretty competitive. So 2 questions for you here. One, how did you find out about them? And then how did you fill out these applications? Did you have some help? And then 2, what was the funding like to be able to go onto these programs?
So the how I found out about them. So the Fulbright summer program, I remember getting an email. So there's no kind of complex story about that. I was just like, I got this email. They're like, it's fully funded to go to the UK, and I was like, great. I almost ignored the email, thinking I'm not competitive enough to even consider this. And then I slept on it and thought, well, you know what, I'm going to try.
Was this like an email from your school, from like maybe the study abroad office, or just like your advisor, or where did that come from?
Came from the study abroad and the competitive scholarship advising office. So yeah, so they sent out these sort of mass emails for all kinds of things. But I think because Linfield has a bit of a reputation for its number of Fulbright grants and awards it's gotten over the years, they make a point of making sure that they have students applying for these competitive programs. And with the theater and oratory, the Jan term class, I think it was the professors there had mentioned that they wanted to do a Jan term, and I thought, well, let's see what that's about and apply for it. So the application processes, I do remember with the Fulbright summer program, it was quite extensive and an intensive process in terms of the editing, the writing, the revising, getting feedback from different faculty at different points throughout that process as well. And of course, having the support of the competitive scholarship advisor, Debbie, who was again a phenomenal advocate and getting students just to get the most polished version of their application as possible. And the same thing with the theater, and oratory program. I remember also going through a couple of different drafts and iterations of nailing the why and really pitching oneself to the faculty or to the selection committee. So the funding for both of those, I will say, was great for the Fulbright summer program. The only things I paid for out of pocket were maybe like souvenirs. So everything else was covered for, which is great. When you're a sophomore in college, you don't have a ton of money to go off of. But and for the theater and oratory class, that my round trip airfare was covered, and I think the only thing I paid for was the credit of the class, which was maybe like $1,000 at the time. I don't know what that looks like now because that was quite a few years ago. But yeah, also the funding, we had like money for meals that the school provided or the program provided, and so it was a pretty sweet setup. Looking back on that, I think in terms of the funding, it was like there was an abundance of funding and. Yeah, so that's kind of how that worked.
So were all of these done in English, since you were going to all of these countries where you maybe didn't know the language?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And is that maybe the case for most of these programs where you're going to countries where you may not be speaking the language?
I think it probably depends on the program. For the study abroad experiences in college, all of that was in English. My graduate school program in the UK also was all in English, and I think that was by design. I mean, granted, they spoke English, of course, but then you have the slight variations in the UK accent and different sort of. There's differences between American English and British English that I can't stress enough.
Okay, well, shifting gears a little bit now to your grad school stuff. So you did all of that in London. So what was that experience of like just the whole thing being in another country? Like, did you have culture shock? Was it completely different from your other shorter experiences? What was going through your head as you were, starting this program out, and how did it go?
One of the highlights of my academic careers is definitely grad school. I loved reading, thinking, and talking about geopolitical theory for a year. And I think I was just so excited to be continuing on this path of an international education, right? And so, that year out there was intense, and it was, I don't think I could have prepared myself for the culture shock. I had already been to Wales as an undergrad before, and that had been, some years prior, but going back was really great. And to actually be in the heart of London was a phenomenal experience. I remember, I'd be walking to class and just look up and think, holy crap, I'm in London. And just lets sort of what I was thinking. And then, I'd sort of go into one of the local libraries or like the Senate House Library and hunker down and read from like 8 in the morning until like 9 o'clock at night. Like those were sorts of the days, as a grad student, I would joke with friends who I'd meet up with, they'd ask me what I had seen in London. And, I'd say, well, I've seen the inside of these libraries really well. I mean, these buildings have pieces of my soul in them. So, but London itself, I haven't really spent a lot of time seeing. And they'd be shocked because I had already been there for like 6 or 8 months. And they'd be like, well, what are you doing? It's like, it's very different when you're going on a trip to hit up London and see all the iconic things versus studying this intensive year-long program. But I think that toward the end, I did get to see some of the iconic stuff. But I think the thing about studying as an international student in the UK is there was this whole adjustment period of British higher education system being unlike anything I had ever experienced, right? And bringing in that sort of American perspective and adjusting to how things are graded. I remember even for the classes at the London School of Economics, there were core required classes and then there were elective classes. And for the elective classes, they made those competitive as well. So you had to submit a sort of essay for why you wanted to take an elective course, and then the professors would select maybe 10 or 15 students that would be allowed into the program. So also, I remember at the beginning sort of feeling a sense of panic because I thought, I've taken out the student loan and I may not be able to get, I got this flight and I'm in the UK and I may not be able to take the classes that I had wanted to take just because of how competitive it is. I was fortunate to get into my elective course as my first choice of courses because I did spend a lot of time. I wrote these like 2-paragraph long rationale for why I really needed to get into these classes. So I think, I made quite a persuasive case. And at that point, when you have a lot riding on an experience like that, you have a tendency to give it your best shot. And so I did those things and I was able to take classes on American grand strategy and histories of American imperialism.
With all of your different study abroad experiences, what were some of the challenges that you faced? And now that you have done them, like, is there anything you would have done differently knowing what you know now?
Yeah, I think there isn't anything I could say that I would do differently. And I think part of it is I looked out with the programs and really clear-eyed about what was motivating me to apply and then go through with these programs. But yeah, I think if anything, I would maybe change the pace at which I was moving or doing things slightly. I think I definitely got the most out of those experiences. And I think that one of the reasons why studying abroad is so transformative and why it's such a wonderful experience is because it really pushes you outside of your comfort zone in ways that you can't even anticipate until you've done it, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I've advocated, with the students I've worked with in the past, in a previous job, or when I'm advising even friends or students now in informal ways or mentoring them, I do always sort of make that plug for studying abroad. And I think it is precisely because I think those experiences were so transformative for me that had I not, spent that summer in Wales or gone to Italy and Greece for a month, or even, I don't think it would have set me up to even consider, doing a master's country like the UK or doing, a summer program in Geneva. Once your mind has kind of been broadened in that way, and once you've put yourself out of your comfort zone in that way, there's really no going back.
Any useful tips that you could offer to other students that are thinking about doing any sort of studying abroad programs or, semesters?
I think it's important to take advantage of connecting and meeting with the staff at, your university or college whose job it is to help you, because they want to help you succeed. And I think most universities and colleges have like a study abroad or a competitive scholarship office of some kind, and they're always promoting, their programs and opportunities. They are the folks who have the insider tips to help you shine as an applicant. And it requires quite a bit of back and forth. And your applications to studying abroad, the first draft isn't going to be the draft you submit. It might be the 5th or 6th draft, and that's okay. And I think also it's easy to get caught up with the different feedback you'll get from different people. And I think it's important to remember that at the end of the day, no one is going on the experience for you. So it's important to trust your gut. And because I remember thinking, particularly with the Fulbright summer program application, I got so much feedback and was sort of inundated with, comments and suggestions for revisions. And it got to a point where I had just too much feedback and I had to kind of reorient myself and think, all right, so let me just make sure I'm putting my best foot forward, that this is, the best reflection of my desires, my motivations, my meditations on what's inspiring me to want to do this in the first place, and then just sort of stick to that guiding principle. So I think that's important to keep in mind, because it is pretty easy to get caught up in other feedback and the editing process. But after a few drafts and after you've worked on it for some time, you'll know when it's polished and ready to send off, and then cross your fingers and just resting in the confidence that you gave it the best you could, and letting sort of fate kind of take it from there and figure out the best opportunities out there for you. And I think part of it too is keeping a sort of roster of the different programs. I mean, I think people like talking a lot about the things that they do get into, of course, the things that they're accepted into, but I also think there's this sort of unspoken element of things that we don't get into, right? The number of rejections that experience. I've had my fair share of rejections over the course of my career, and it just helps orient, and guide one's own career and one's own interests and passions and whatever else. So yeah, I think just trusting your gut and trusting yourself and following that call to adventure, if that's and whatever that looks like, for everyone is a little different. But yes, definitely those would be the few bits of advice I could share.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Clara. And thank you so much for joining us today on our podcast and sharing a little bit about your experiences and just really great advice and tips about studying abroad. It sounds like they were definitely transformative for you and definitely left a mark on your journey going forward. So really glad to hear it. Really glad that it all worked out and you had a great time.
Thank you so much.
As you've heard from our guests, studying abroad is a transformative experience that allows you to grow in ways you couldn't have imagined. It can open up your world to expose you to different ways of doing things, new cultures, and new languages. To take advantage of these opportunities, though, it's important to apply and prepare early so that you can put your best foot forward in the applications and help guarantee that spot in a program abroad. Although the process can feel out of reach at times, our guest explains that it can be a very manageable thing, and as first gens, we often have unique stories that can set us apart and add value to any program. So if you've ever considered the possibility of studying abroad, take that first step today to learn more. Thanks again to our speakers, and thank you for tuning in today on How to College for First Gens. For more information about this episode, check out our website at howtocollegefirstgen.org. If you prefer to reach us on social media, you can find us at How to College First Gen on Instagram and Facebook, and HTC First Gen on Twitter. We'd love to hear about your own experience, what you think, what you're struggling with, or how we can help. Remember, you are not alone in this journey. Until next time.